Hello students, welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Welcome to a session on economy this week, wherein we'll be taking up some of the very important articles that have appeared in various business related newspapers and we'll be analyzing these particular articles. For this particular video, the time period that I've chosen is from 6th of May to 19th of May, and the newspaper articles that I'll be discussing in this particular video will be from Business Line, Hindu, Business Standard, Indian Express, Live Mint. Let's begin this particular discussion. The first article is related to concept of sectoral ETFs. To understand this particular article, you need to understand two very important concepts. One is the concept of ETF, that is exchange traded fund, and second one is concept of a disinvestment. Let me start with the second concept. In case of disinvestment, what we basically see is Government of India will be selling off its ownership in the public sector enterprises. And when it sells off this particular ownership, it will be collecting certain money or raising revenues. But when I say selling off, Government of India may sell off part of the ownership, majority of the ownership, or full ownership of this particular public sector enterprise. Government of India, post the LPG reforms, has conducted disinvestment wherein it has either sold part of the ownership, or it has sold off majority of the ownership, or it has sold off the full company to a buyer in a market. But usually practiced methodology, or most often used methodology in every year's union budget, is by selling part of the ownership of these particular CPSEs. Now please understand, Government of India usually sells off part of the ownership for a simple reason. It doesn't want to lose, or it doesn't want to give away the management control of this particular CPSE. That is a precise reason. Many of the times you will see government will keep on selling the shares of these particular CPSEs, but when the shares or the ownership of the Government of India falls anywhere in the range of 55% or just above 52%, government will stop selling the shares of this particular CPSE. Because if it further sells it off, the ownership might fall below 51%. It simply means Government of India ceded the management control of this particular company. That is a precise reason. You will see government will keep on choosing various CPSEs in various years and will be selling part of the ownership in these particular CPSEs. Now, one of the methodologies which has been introduced very recently to conduct this particular disinvestment process is through the concept of an ETF. ETF stands for exchange traded funds. What is the concept? We'll understand in a minute. But in the last 1 year itself, a lot of times the newspapers have reported on this particular concept of an ETF. So please understand this particular concept very carefully. Now, ETF is basically a mixture of mutual funds as well as indexed funds. What do you understand by the concept of a mutual fund? Basically, concept of mutual fund refers to a system wherein various investors will pull in their investment and a manager will invest on their behalf in the market on various instruments. He can invest in debt instruments, he can invest in equity instruments, so on and so forth. But basically understand this. These investors will not own these particular debt or equity instruments directly. What they will own is a unit which has been issued by this particular company. That is, a mutual fund company will issue units to these particular investors. This is a concept of a mutual fund. In case of an indexed fund, understand this. In case of a BSE, there are 30 stocks. That is, when I calculate the BSE Sensex, I take the market capitalization of these particular 30 stocks or 30 company shares. If I basically pick up one share from each of the 30 companies, I'll repeat the statement. Out of 30 companies, I will collect or I'll purchase one share from these all 30 companies. So my portfolio will consist of 30 shares, and all these 30 shares, or out of all these particular 30 shares, one share each will belong to these particular 30 companies. Now, can I simply say, whenever the Sensex will vary, my portfolio value will also vary in the same direction. That is, if Sensex increases, the value of my investment will also increase. And if the Sensex falls down, the value of my investment will also fall down in the same way. This happens for a simple reason. In case of Sensex, the market capitalization of all the 30 companies taken, whereas my investment portfolio consists of one share each from these 30 companies. This investment that I've done in these 30 shares is nothing but an example of indexed funds. That is, value of my funds or investments will be indexed with a certain number or with certain parameter. As this particular reference point varies, my value of investments will also vary. This is the basic concept of a mutual fund and investment fund. Now understand this, ETF is a mixture of a mutual fund as well as investment fund. What happens in ETFs? Government of India has introduced two types of ETFs. One is CPSE ETF and the second one is Bharat 22 ETF. This was introduced back in the year 2014 and this was launched in the year 2017. What is the basic difference between this as well as this? Here in the CPS ETF, initially when it was launched, it consisted of units which were formed by taking into consideration shares of 10 companies or stocks of 10 companies. I'll repeat the statement here. CPSE ETF was launched by considering the stocks of 10 CPSEs. In simple terms, these units which I purchase, which is nothing but CPS ETF, its value is based on what? The shares or the stock value of these particular 10 companies. But very recently, at the fag end of 2018, Government of India has restructured this particular CPS ETF. Now rather than having 10 companies, we are having 11 companies or stocks of 11 companies. Now why it was done? Very simple reason. Government of India in certain cases found out that if they further sell off the shares of this particular CPSE, the ownership will come down or will fall below 51%. It will be losing the management control of this particular CPSE. Hence, Government of India said, we will not sell the shares of this. Since it is a part of a CPS ETF, take it out, introduce a new CPSE. And second reason why it was reformed was one of the company, Rural Electrification Corporation. This was merged with Power Finance Corporation. Now, since this is going to be merged or this will be owned by this company, Government of India will not have the right to sell the shares of this in the market. That is a precise reason Government of India has restructured this particular CPSE ETF. Rather than having the shares or the stocks of 10 CPSEs, now we have got stocks or the shares of 11 CPSEs in the CPSE ETF. Whereas on the other side, in case of Bharat 22 ETF, the stocks from various companies, specifically 22 companies from 6 sectors are being provided. That is, I'll take the stocks of all these 22 companies which are from 6 sectors, I will pool them or bundle them, sell it in the form of a Bharat 22 ETF. Very recently, even this particular Bharat 22 ETF was reconstituted or restructured by the government. Now, Government of India, by selling CPSE ETF as well as Bharat 22 ETF, is able to generate huge amount of revenues which will help it meet the disinvestment target. Now, what is the concept which has been provided in this particular article? We already know that Government of India is issuing CPSE ETF as well as Bharat 22 ETF. The news article basically discusses new types of ETFs which the Government of India is thinking of issuing in the market. These are referred as sectoral ETFs. Now, what we have seen is, in case of Bharat 22 ETF, it will consist stocks or the shares of various companies which are listed or which are from 6 sectors. What if I'm an investor who wishes to invest only in the metals sector? That is, in a company which is involved in this particular sector, I want to invest in the shares of this company only. Or else, what if I want to invest in the shares of a company which is involved in the banking sector only? Or for that matter, energy sector only. Bharat 22 ETF doesn't provide this kind of a specialization, neither does a CPSE ETF. Hence, to take care of these kind of investors who are interested in investing only these particular sectors, Government of India is thinking of issuing 3 more ETFs, one in banking sector, second in case of energy sector, and the third one in case of metal and commodity CPSE. Now, rest of the information that is provided in this particular article is not very important for a simple reason. We do not know how many companies or the shares of how many companies will be considered in each of these particular ETFs as of now. Once Government of India comes out with the guidelines, we will discuss and understand the concept of the banking ETF, energy ETF, metal and commodity CPSE ETFs. So this is the information which has been provided in this particular article. Based on this, let's solve a question. Consider the following statements. CPSE ETF and Bharat 22 ETF were launched by the government in 2014. Only CPSE ETF was launched in 2014. Bharat 22 ETF was launched later. So the first statement is wrong. Second, Bharat 22 ETF is managed by ICICI Prudential AMC. In case of mutual funds, we basically discussed that the investors will pool in their funds or will invest, and a manager will take these particular funds and invest in the market on their behalf. Now, in the same way, in case of ETFs, exchange traded funds, the money that I invest by purchasing one unit of an ETF will go to a company called as asset management company. And this particular asset management company will provide these particular funds as per the weightage given to these particular shares or weightage given to these particular sectors. In case of mutual funds, what we saw was investors will pool in their funds and manager will use these particular funds to invest in the market. Now, in case of the ETFs, that is exchange traded funds, if I purchase one unit of an ETF and pay, let's say, X rupees, now a company will collect this particular X rupees and give it to the respective companies which are there in this particular Bharat 22 ETF. This particular company which is involved in this kind of a function is called as asset management company. So remember this, in case of the CPSE ETF, it is Reliance AMC, and in case of Bharat 22 ETF, it is ICICI Prudential AMC. So second statement is correct. Based on this, the right option will be option B, only second statement is true. The second article is related to India-US trade. Now, in the recent times, there have been a lot of discussion as well as the deliberation which is happening between the two parties, that is Government of India as well as the US government. The representatives of both of these particular governments are negotiating, are holding deliberations, discussing certain issues, and are trying to come out with certain agreements. Now, apart from this, there are 7 disputes at various stages which are being deliberated under dispute resolution mechanism of WTO. Now, this particular article basically discusses the contention of the US government that India imposes a huge amount of trade barriers in the form of tariff as well as non-tariff barriers, which are basically hindering the business done by US companies in India. Now, beyond this, no much information has been provided apart from the political news in this particular article. Now, let's try and understand what is the factual situation of trade relation between India and US. The fact of matter is this: a country which has got a better manufacturing or cost-effective manufacturing, which will lead to competitiveness in the international market, will end up exporting these particular products. The argument of USA government is that US market is the largest exporting or largest export market for India. That is, out of total exports are done by India, the highest exports land up in the US market. Whereas Indian market is the 13th largest destination for the US export. This kind of an argument has been made by the US government to show that or to prove that Government of India has been imposing tariff as well as non-tariff barriers, and that is the reason why their exports are not increasing to Indian market. Now, you need to understand 2 points here. Yes, it is true that India exports more than 1/5 of its exports to the US market, but having said so, it doesn't mean that US doesn't export anything to India. US is one of the major exporter of capital to Indian market. That is, it exports a huge amount of a capital in the form of FDI and FPI to Indian market. And in return, these particular investments will take out earnings from the Indian market. So, Indian market is exporting goods and services and is earning dollars. Whereas, US investors are making a huge amount of investment in the form of FDI, FPI and are taking out the dollars from the Indian market. So when US argues that India is imposing tariff as well as non-tariff barriers and it is hindering their exports, they are not taking into account these kind of earnings are done by the US market in the form of capital flows. Apart from this, in favor of the government position in India, WTO has stated that the tariffs which were imposed by the government or precisely the peak tariffs which have been imposed by the government of India have been declining over a period of time. Post 1990, the peak tariff was somewhere in the range of 150%. But in the recent times, it has been reduced to around 10%. And Indian tariffs are moving more and more towards the tariffs in the Asian region. So this is the argument which has been put forward by WTO. But apart from this, you must also understand this particular concept. Yes, India imposes a huge amount of a tariff. On an average, it is at around 13.5%. Now based on this, let's look at a question. Consider the following statements. As per WTO, India on an average imposes 13% approximately tariffs on imports. Yes, it's true. Post-liberalization reforms, the import tariffs in India have been decreasing. Generally, yes, it has been decreasing in case of India. Both the statements 1 and 2 are correct. Right option will be option C. Both are true. The next article is related to the concept of NPA issue. Now, this particular article, which appeared in The Hindu, has provided the whole history or has given the points related to the genesis of NPAs to what reforms should be implemented by Government of India. Let's look at this particular article. Basically, the article says that in case of India, the NPAs have ballooned. At one point of a time, that is in the financial year 08, the NPAs were somewhere in the range of 2.6% of the gross loans which are issued. This has ballooned to around 11.2% by financial year 2017 and 2018. So you can see that the NPAs or the non-performing assets have increased by a huge value in a span of a decade. Now the question is, what are the reasons why these NPAs have ballooned to such a huge extent? The reasons which have been cited in the article are: 1. The credit which was given to the corporate sector increased by a huge value during a period of 2004-5 to 2008 and 9. This was done in expectation of a huge GDP growth rate for the Indian economy. In simple terms, companies expected India's GDP growth rate to continue at around 9%, and since the growth rate estimation was very high or expectation was very high, companies took huge amount of loans, created capacity, wanted to sell it off in the market, generate huge amount of revenues as well as profits. This is one issue. Second, what actually happened was different. There were certain issues with land acquisition, issues with the licensing regime, as a result of which various projects got stalled. And whenever the projects will get stalled or stopped like this, the cost related to the project will start escalating. This will put a huge financial pressure on the developer or the one who has set up this particular project. Third, added to this, there is a global financial crisis. Post 2008, there is a global financial crisis, following which there was a slowdown. Now, whenever the crisis as well as the slowdown will happen, the revenues of these particular companies will get affected. And whenever the revenues will get affected, the repayment ability of these particular companies will also get affected. Let's say hypothetically, I'm a company, I took a loan from a bank, created capacity. In simple terms, I purchased machines, wanted to produce more goods and sell it in the market because I expected GDP of India will increase. But because of various issues, let's say I will produce the goods, I'm unable to sell it in the domestic market nor in the international market. Or even if I sell it, I'm not able to sell whatever I have produced. As a result of this, what will happen? My revenue collection will fall down, profits will fall down. In many of the cases, rather than earning profits, the companies ended up incurring losses. Now, whenever this will happen, I will default on my repayment to the bank. I don't have money, so I will default on the repayment. And since I'm defaulting, the NPAs in the banking sector will increase. And added to this, there was a volatility in the forex market. That is, because of various reasons, rupee depreciated. And if I'm a company who has borrowed from the foreign market in the form of ECB, external commercial borrowings. That is, in simple terms, let's assume I'm an Indian company. I will go to UK market and borrow from one of the financial institutions from the UK market. Now, some of you will have this kind of a doubt. Why is that an Indian company is borrowing from a bank in the UK? It is done for a simple reason. The rate of interest on such loans in UK are lesser. Yes, as a borrower, I am facing the risk of volatility. That is, if I borrow when the exchange rate was like this and I am repaying when the exchange rate is like this. That is, I borrowed when $1 was equivalent to 40 rupees and I am repaying when the $1 value is equal to 50. In simple terms, I brought in, let's say, $1 into India. I will exchange it. I'll get how many rupees? 40 rupees. But if I want to repay $1 back to the bank in UK or back to the bank in USA, I will have to pay 50 rupees to purchase $1. So whenever there is an exchange rate volatility, the pressure on the repayment will be very high on these particular companies in India which have borrowed in the form of external commercial borrowings. And what was seen in this particular case is the repayment liability on Indian companies which had borrowed from the foreign market in the form of ECBs because of the rupee volatility increased, or the pressure on these particular companies increased. Now look at this. An Indian company is facing issue with respect to the global slowdown or the global financial crisis followed by slowdown, is facing issue of projects getting stalled up because of issue of environmental clearances, issue of a land acquisition, and apart from this, he is also facing one more issue, that is rupee depreciation. Whenever Indian rupee depreciates, the ECBs or the liability of ECBs on such companies is also going to increase. As a result of all these particular issues, these particular companies started defaulting on their repayments to the bank. As a result of this, NPAs in the banking sector increased. This is the evolution of NPA which has been provided in this particular article. Now, what should be done? This particular article says that many of the experts, most of the times, call for privatization of these particular public sector banks. Their go-to argument is, look at the private sector banks, their NPAs are lesser. And since their NPAs are lesser, efficient working is associated with them, you should also privatize the public sector banks. But this particular article is against this particular argument of privatization. It quotes two reasons. One, it doesn't mean that private sectors do not have any kind of NPAs. In fact, some of the very big private sector banks have huge amount of NPAs. It quotes the example of ICICI, which has approximately 10% of their gross loans in the form of NPAs. So one argument is what? Even the private sector banks suffer from NPAs. Second argument is that many of the consortia of lenders, that is group of lenders who have given loan to big companies, who have started defaulting on these particular loans, these particular consortia also consist of private sector banks. So whatever are the issues which are plaguing the public sector banks are also the same issues which are plaguing the private sector banks. Hence, we cannot simply say that we should convert the public sector banks into private sector banks. So what should be done in the banking sector? This article lays out two sets of reforms to overcome the issue of NPAs in the banking sector. One, set of reforms which has to be implemented immediately, and the second is a set of reforms which has to be implemented in the medium term. The immediate reforms which have to be implemented are: 1. Government of India should infuse the capital in one go rather than infusing the capital installment wise. That is, over a period of time, we are seeing that Government of India will keep on infusing capital year after year in the form of recapitalization in the banking sector. This article argues that rather than providing recapitalization in installments like this, Government of India should infuse this particular capital in one go itself. Second, a particular authority has to be set up which shall look into the recovery of the NPAs or the resolution of the NPAs. And the third, banks must be allowed to accept the losses in the NPAs or accept the haircuts in the NPAs without any repercussions. For example, harassment by investigating agencies. So these are the three very important reforms which have been recommended in this article, which the government should take in the short term or immediately. Apart from this, some of the other recommendations which the government has to take in the medium term are: 1. It has to strengthen the functioning of these particular public sector banks. It has to develop certain systems which will take care of these particular macroeconomic prudential issues. And third, it has to provide a risk management system in these particular public sector banks. So these are the reforms which have been recommended in this particular article. Based on this, the next article is related to infrastructure investments. Now, in case of India, the investment in infrastructure either has to come from the public sector, that is through the government, or it has to come from the private sector. Over a period of time, the contribution of the private sector has been increasing in the Indian market. But of late, this particular contribution is not increasing at a pace which is satisfactory. For example, in the 11th 5-year plan, the contribution from the private sector in the infrastructure investment was somewhere in the range of 7% of GDP, which was around 5% of GDP in the 10th 5-year plan. And the absolute contribution from the private sector in the 11th 5-year plan compared to the previous 5-year plan increased by around 15%. So what you can see is the private sector investment in these particular infrastructure sector have increased over a period of time. But in the off late, that is post the 11th 5-year plan, we targeted huge amount of investment from the private sector in the infrastructure sector. As per the 12th 5-year plan, around 48% of the investment in the infrastructure was expected to come from the private sector itself. And the total amount of investment that was projected in the 12th 5-year plan or estimated in the 12th 5-year plan was somewhere in the range of 50 lakh crore rupees. But it has been seen that the private sector investment has been much lesser than what was estimated in the 12th 5-year plan. In fact, as per one estimate, the private sector investment during the 12th 5-year plan has been around 5% of GDP. Now, the reasons for this particular decline in the private sector investment has been: 1. Issues with the projects, that is because of various issues such as environmental clearances, land acquisition, etc. Various projects are getting stalled or getting stopped. Now, as a result of this, the infrastructure investment from the private sector is getting affected. Now, 2 points you must understand here is: 1. Whenever the investment in infrastructure from the private sector will come down, it is the public sector which will step up and increase its investment in the infrastructure. But more importantly, there is a limit on how much the government should invest or can invest in the infrastructure. Because Government of India, majority of the times, will be worried about its fiscal numbers, that is specifically fiscal deficit. And since our revenue expenditure majority of the times overshoots the budget estimates, there is a pressure on the capital expenditure. Hence, there is a limit on how much Government of India can invest in the infrastructure sector. So if you want to increase the investment in the infrastructure, it has to come from the private sector itself. And second, if you want to increase the investment in the infrastructure, as estimated by the government, infrastructure will require or will need investment of around 1 lakh crore rupees in the coming years. You should be able to promote the investment from the private sector. So based on this, what should be done so as to ensure that the investment from the private sector in infrastructure will increase? This particular article discusses some of the very important recommendations given by Vijay Kelkar Committee on PPP. Please go through these particular recommendations, as even the NITI Aayog document has mentioned these particular committee recommendations. There might be a probable question in the UPSC based on these particular recommendations itself. Now, some of the recommendations which have been cited in this particular article are: 1. Independent sector regulators have to be set up. That is, for every sector, there has to be an independent regulator who shall regulate the stakeholders in these particular sectors. The argument which has been provided by the Kelkar committee is that in some of the sectors, such as railways, such as roads, the ministry itself is responsible for formation of the policy, implementation of the policy, investment, as well as the regulation. And whenever all these particular functions are done by only one authority, the private sector will not be inclined to invest in such a sector. For example, in case of railways, even this particular issue has been flagged by another committee, that is Vivek Debrah committee, as a reason why railways is unable to attract higher private investments. So 1, you will have to set up independent sector regulators so as to ensure that there is no conflict of interest in these particular infrastructure projects. Second, what we see majority of the times is the risk associated with the projects are given only to the private sector. That is, the risk associated with the project will be borne by the private sector alone. Whereas issues such as land acquisition can be taken by the government itself. That is, Government of India or the state government should provide or should acquire the land on behalf of the company which is going to set up the infrastructure project there. It makes much more sense. The litigations will be much lesser, issues will be much lesser. Whereas all these particular risks are the issues associated with the projects are borne by the private sector itself. As a result of this, the cost of the project always escalates. There are issues with the land acquisition, the project gets stalled, which will affect the investment of the private sector in such projects. Third, it also recommended appointing 2 authorities. That is, 1, PPP, Project Review Committee, Infrastructure PPP, Adjudicatory Tribunal. Both of these particular authorities will provide for change in the conditions of a agreement which has been signed between the private sector as well as the government. Now, what is the importance of this? Let's say hypothetically, there was a huge growth rate which was happening in a particular sector. As a result of this, the demand for the infrastructure in such sector was increasing. More and more conditions were favorable for the growth of infrastructure in such sectors. Let's say hypothetically, a private sector company enters into an agreement with the Government of India to develop a project under the model of a PPP in this particular sector. Now, let's say suddenly the market or this particular sector suffers from a slowdown. Now, in this particular context, where the economic parameters have changed, the conditions which are put in this particular agreement should also be made flexible. These 2 authorities will look into this particular issue. So, these are some of the recommendations which have been given in Kelkar committee, which have been discussed in this particular article. Now, based on this, let's discuss a question. Economic growth in a country X will necessarily have to occur if various conditions have been given. Based on this, you will have to decide which is the most important precursor which will lead to economic growth. A, there is a technological progress in the world economy. Now, let's say there is a technological progress in the world economy. Does that mean it is necessary to have a GDP growth rate in India, or it will lead to GDP growth rate in India? Not necessary. Second, population growth in country X. If India's population increases, does it necessarily mean that there is a GDP growth rate? No. Even this is wrong. Third, there is a capital formation in country X. We have discussed earlier the concept of a private investment as well as government investment. Now, what is the importance of this? Investments will lead to formation of the capital. And whenever there is a formation of the capital, you will see growth happening in any of the economy. Understand this. Whenever there is a formation of the capital, it leads to growth. But also remember this. When I say increase in capital will lead to growth, I am basically ensuring that there is a capital efficiency. What do you mean by capital efficiency? I'll discuss 2 concepts here. Capital efficiency, capital deepening. Capital efficiency basically means for every investment that I'm doing, the productivity of this particular investment is increasing. Let's say hypothetically, to produce 1 unit of a good, earlier I invested 10 rupees or the capital investment was 10 rupees. If this is reduced to less than 10 rupees, it basically means that my investment is becoming more and more efficient. I've got to understand this. Whenever the efficiency of the investment increases, we call this as a capital efficiency. And whenever there's a capital efficiency, it leads to growth. But apart from this, there's also a concept of a capital deepening. And whenever there's a capital deepening, remember this. It may not necessarily lead to growth. That is, in case of capital deepening, your investment will increase. But let's say the technology that you're using is very much outdated technology. Since you're investing huge amount of money, but the technology is very much outdated, your production may not increase. And since your production is not increasing, it will not necessarily lead to growth. So remember this, capital formation generally, yes, it will lead to growth in any of the economies. But if there is a capital deepening in this particular economy, this economy may not necessarily achieve higher growth rate. So the right option will be option C. But let's eliminate the D also. The volume of trade grows in the world economy. Now let's say the trade amongst all the other countries in the world increases. Does that necessarily mean that there is higher GDP growth rate in the Indian economy? Not necessarily. So option C is the most appropriate option out of all these particular options. So these are the various articles as well as the questions related to these particular articles for this particular time period. Thank you. Have a good day.